Dawn was breaking on the first day of the week. The Sabbath was over. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary had come to look at the tomb, when suddenly there was a great earthquake. An angel of the Lord came down from heaven. He came to the stone, rolled it away, and sat down on top of it. Looking at him was like looking at lightning, and his clothes were white like snow. The guards trembled with terror at him and became like corpses themselves. "Don't be afraid," said the angel to the woman. "I know you're looking for Jesus who was crucified. He isn't here. He's been raised, as he said he would be. Come and see the place where he was lying. And then go at once and tell his disciples that he's been raised from the dead and that he's going on ahead of you to Galilee. That's where you'll see him. There, I've told you." The woman scurried off quickly away from the tomb in a mixture of terror and great delight and went to tell his disciples. Suddenly, there was Jesus himself. He met them and said, "Greetings." They came up to him and took hold of his feet, prostrating themselves in front of him. "Don't be afraid," said Jesus to them. "Go and tell my brothers that they should go to Galilee. Tell them they'll see me there." Today really is a day of days. Millions, if not billions, of Christians around the world are celebrating with you and I today the resurrected Jesus Christ. It is a day in which Jesus, no longer just a carpenter Rabbi from Nazareth, was crowned King of the Jews, King of the world, and sovereign over death. It was, for Jesus' disciples, a mixture of great terror and great delight, a moment of great tragedy and great triumph. But regardless, it was a moment that reshaped their worldview in every conceivable way. What is a worldview? It's the way that you and I see and think about the world. Ultimately, it determines the way that we live in the world. Jesus' death, his resurrection, punched a hole in history and challenges every person to reevaluate their own worldview. It was, for Jesus' disciples, a day in which their dreams died. The disciples were not expecting a resurrection because they were not expecting a death. Their hopes, their dreams had been pinned on a Messiah, a Savior, a champion who would defeat their persecutors, their oppressors, the empire that had an iron grip on their lives. And that freedom, that dream of freedom, died when Jesus died, which is why it was so terrifying and such a great moment of tragedy for his followers. But what they could not see at the time, but which they began to see after Jesus' resurrection, was that it was also a day in which death died. Their dreams died, yes, but death died too. Dead people do not normally come back to life. And when Jesus was raised from the dead, he did not just cure the death that had killed him, but he had forever removed the sting from death itself, so that you and I also no longer need to be afraid of death. These two great markers of our existence, when we are born and when we die, they do not have to be the only markers in our existence. And death does not have to be the last word or the last chapter. And on this day of days, we also dare to declare, what is the central message of Christianity? The central message is that Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. If you type in, what is a worldview into Google, one of the first results that it will return is in reference to a Christian worldview. And it says, a Christian worldview revolves around the battle of good and evil. That's not the Christian worldview at all. And that leads to a purely binary perspective of the world in which everything is categorized either as good or as evil. But the Christian worldview has at its heart the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The central claim that we make is not that Jesus was a great teacher, a powerful healer, an inspiring leader, or the victim of a gross miscarriage of justice. All of that may be true, but that wouldn't add up to the early Christian faith and life. The crucial fact is that Jesus was bodily raised after being well and truly dead and buried. And we are a community of people who not only say Jesus was raised from the dead, but show it by the way that we live our lives. And that is a true declaration. So how should we live? Our declaration should be one of dependence, not of independence. The angel said to the women in our story, "Don't be afraid." When they encountered Jesus, Jesus himself says, "Don't be afraid." And that is not just a platitude. That is the reality for us if we live our lives with a resurrected worldview. Our biggest problem is not our suffering, and I know that that can sound cold and callous. It is not meant to be. We've made suffering our biggest problem. But in reality, our biggest problem is sin. Now that requires a careful explanation, and it requires a good definition of sin. And I'd like to offer this one. Sin, living in God's world without reference to Him. When we live independently, when we live whether in moments of great delight or moments of great terror, in tragic circumstances or in triumphant circumstances, when we live without reference to God, that is our biggest problem. So for us, our declaration as a declaration of dependence upon God should be one of neither forgetting Him when things are good, nor cursing Him when things are bad, but rather trusting Him. And that declaration of trust, of contentment, when we have little or much, that is a declaration of dependence on God. Living without reference to God, I don't need you, or I don't want you. But when we trust God, we demonstrate to the world that this resurrected Jesus Christ has reshaped our lives, transformed our hopes and our dreams and our desires, and made it so that death is not the last chapter or the last word. When we live a life dependent on God, we make a simple declaration that Jesus Christ is risen. My sins are forgiven, and regardless of my suffering, I will not be afraid. But that does not mean to say that we should ignore suffering, and that we should especially ignore the suffering of others. Because, of course, part of that making suffering our biggest problem is that if we are only concerned with our own suffering, that's all we can see. I always remember what C.S. Lewis said about that. When you have a toothache, that's the only thing that you can think of. It's an all-consuming pain that completely envelops us. And that is the only worldview that we have at that time. And everything that we see and think about is filtered through that particular pain. It is difficult to escape that suffering. And it's easy to say that making reference to God, depending on God and trusting in God is exactly what we should be doing, living a resurrected life and a resurrected worldview. But it is not easy. But one of the things that we can do in our declaration is to not only think of ourselves, but to think of others. So that leads me to the second point of this declaration. So we make a declaration of dependence, but we also make a declaration of discipleship. There is no point in the resurrection if it doesn't change the way that we live. And this day of days was the day in which Jesus' discipleship program was launched. But that discipleship is neither one of fanaticism, nor of idleness, just sitting around and doing nothing or living our own way. In other words, discipleship is not living life on our own terms, because when we are in charge, we tend to extremes. Jesus kept pointing his disciples towards a middle ground, and the middle ground, that third way, was a life of servanthood. Disciples serve a king, and in his footsteps we serve others. And with all of the suffering that's going on in the world right now, we have an opportunity as believers to step into the fray and to serve, to lay our lives down in the greatest act of discipleship, as Jesus himself did, and become a servant to others. Neither fanatical, not like zealots in our faith, not idle, just letting life roll by, but servants, like the Good Samaritan serving our neighbor. And for us, our neighbor is every human being on the planet. That's what it means to be a disciple, to declare the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It is also, finally, a declaration of destiny, because this is who we were meant to be. Jesus' death was not the greatest demonstration of God's love. Jesus' resurrection was the greatest demonstration of God's love. And when you look at your neighbors, at your fellow human beings with a resurrected worldview, you see not only others that Jesus died for, but you see people that Jesus was raised to life for. And we, just as God loved us and loves us now and loves our neighbors in exactly the same way, we can declare this day of days when we also love our neighbors. That's what it means to be a Christian with a resurrected worldview. It offers us a direct route to the people that we were meant to be and to the way in which we treat others. So, when we speak of destiny, we're speaking not of optimism, nor of pessimism, but of hope. And the remarkable thing about this story is that on a day when Jesus' disciples' dreams died, what Jesus ultimately did, what God ultimately did for him, for those followers, was when their dreams had died, and there's the key, their dreams had died, their idea of what the Messiah was and should do for them died. God replaced it with a hope, a genuine hope, a hope that was grounded in the reality of what Jesus had done for them when he had put to death death. Optimism for us is the best result, the best thing that could happen. This world is the best of all possible worlds. It might say that good will ultimately prevail over evil, that binary view again. It might even say that I'm confident that we will get through this. But optimism can be flawed. It can be flawed when its focus is purely on the future, and it can be flawed ultimately when there's no reference to God. So for optimism to become hope, we need to reference God in our lives. And ultimately, the resurrection. Pessimism is grounded in the worst possible thing that could happen. This thing could not get any worse. This looks like evil is prevailing over good. Again, that binary view. But again, it's flawed, and it's flawed without reference to God. We, as believers, do not surrender our hope. We dare to declare, so that just as we have heard and hope, others may hear and hope. Paul, writing to the church in Colossae, says, "But you must stay deeply rooted and firm in your faith. You must not give up the hope you received when you heard the good news. It was preached to everyone on earth, and I myself have become a servant of this message." Serve Jesus, not just as the carpenter Rabbi, but as the crowned King and sovereign over death. And serve one another. Serve your neighbor. And in doing so, declare that your faith is grounded firmly in this resurrected Jesus. God bless you on this day of days, on this glorious Easter day.